On this episode of History Hunters, we are going to visit Knights Ferry, California. A lot of people know about this covered bridge behind me at 330 feet long. It is the longest covered bridge west of the Mississippi. A lot of people, however, do not know that future President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, visited this little town back in the gold rush days because his wife's brothers lived here. So that's what we're going to focus on, but we're also going to show you some historical aspects of this beautiful little town on the Stanislaus River. Ulysses S. Grant had been in the Army for 9 years when he arrived in San Francisco on August 17, 1852, and he didn't waste much time coming out here to visit his brothers-in-law, Louis and John Dent, who were the brothers of his wife, Julia Dent Grant. He went by steamer up to the Delta in Stockton, and then he rode by mule, I understand, 40 miles from Stockton to Knights Ferry. At that time, the gold rush was still on. Gold had been discovered in California in 1848. The gold rush hit the following year, 1849. So this was a bustling place. The Dents operated a ferry and charged quite a bit of money to people traveling to the mines up in Sonora and the southern mines south of here. Grant was so impressed with the money that his brothers-in-law were making, the equivalent of about $1,500 to $3,000 a day in their operation at the ferry and the tavern, that he had some grandiose ideas of going into business for himself, getting out of the Army, making enough money, and heading back to Missouri, where his wife was living, in St. Louis at the time. Julia Dent never had the opportunity to come out here to California to visit her brothers. In fact, she was giving birth to her first child, Frederick Dent Grant. When he was in California, especially up north in Humboldt County, he was extremely depressed. The weather was not to his liking, and he was missing his family. He desperately wanted to change his lifestyle. Here's a little plaque at the south side of the bridge. Toll bridge until purchased by the county in 1885. So when Grant came visiting here in 1852 to 1854, this was part of San Joaquin County, and it didn't become a part of Stanislaus County until an act of the legislature in about April of 1860. In 1862, it became the county seat of Stanislaus County for the next 10 years until a growing city of Modesto wrestled it away from this tiny village. But this is a pretty cool bridge. There's concrete remnants of the old Crib Dam, plain as day up there. It was built in 1854 to divert water to the flour mill on the north side of the river. So we're going to try to find these Indian grinding stones that were left here by the Digger Indians. If this area looks familiar to you in movies, you may have seen it in Shadow Riders. Tom Selleck, Catherine Ross, and Ben Johnson. Oh, and Sam Elliott were all here. I believe it was June of 1982 they were here. And they shot their scenes right down here, right there at the river's edge on this side. At the time, Tom Selleck said that there were a lot of rattlesnakes here. What do you think of this place?
Beautiful.
So we found them. These are the original Indian grinding holes that the Indians, the Digger Indians, used these to grind up acorns for their meal. There's one right there, and there's one right there on this spot overlooking the Stanislaus River Canyon. So the Digger Indians used to populate this area of eastern Stanislaus County prior to 1900 and even after 1900. And when Ulysses S. Grant was here, he no doubt had some exposure to the Indians, probably saw them. So I'm just wondering what kind of relationship or attitude he had towards the Digger Indians here at the time. As late as the 1920s, 1910s, you could see Indians paddling up this river in their canoes. Much different time back then.
5, 6 vultures.
So this is the northern end of the covered bridge that dates back to 1863. Sarah's up there. Think of all this heavy rock that they had to stack on the native boulders for the approach. Now in 1955 there was a flood and the water came up to almost the bottom of the bridge, but because the stone foundation was very strong, it was never in peril of getting washed away, unlike the flood of 1861 and 2. A bridge a 2-mile bar upstream was dislodged and drifted down here and crashed into the original bridge and wiped it away. That flood of 1862 nearly wiped out most of Knights Ferry as well.
You know, legend has it that Ulysses S. Grant helped design this bridge, but there's no evidence to support that.
This bridge was closed to vehicular traffic in 1981 out of structural concerns. I remember driving my Camaro across this bridge in the 1970s. This bridge was originally built by David Locke and later owned by the Tullocks. They made money, of course, by charging a toll for each person who crossed it. Of course, the bigger load you had, the more you paid. So wagons paid more than the 25 cents that pedestrians paid to cross. That's how they recouped their expenses. The County Board of Supervisors had to approve the building of this bridge. The Prowse house. So this house was built around 1854 by David Locke. It was the mill house, served as a mill office and residence over the next century. At the turn of the century, the flour mill was converted into a hydroelectric plant, and the plant manager was Tom Prowse, and he lived here. He lived here until the plant closed in 1927. There was a book that Tom Prowse wrote that I remember he had talked about an incident in which the days of the power plant were working over here. Somehow one of the power lines went down, a dog came up to it, sniffed it, and immediately was fried. So the man seen here on this donkey was Frank Lord. He was tragically electrocuted in the powerhouse when he accidentally opened 2 switches at the same time to a phone system, and he knew better, and he ended up getting fried. Tom Prowse's initials are carved in the walls of this house. And there you go. T.H. Prowse, July 11th, 1900. 1900. Can you believe that? This is limestone, I believe. It's quarried from a place not far from here. I'm going to take you over and show you another house that was made of limestone. So as it turns out, the HEP on this wall stands for hydroelectric power. In 1960, this old flour mill was the scene of a movie shot here. It was named Tess of the Storm Country, starring Diane Baker and Jack Ging. I've never seen it or heard of it. On a prior trip here, Sarah found her name Sarah etched into one of these bricks. She posed with it, and that's what she's trying to do. She's trying to find it again. You can't find it.
I'm fairly certain it was like at,
No, it's right there.
I thought it was one that was etched pretty good.
She did not do that etching. So originally this was a flour mill, and around 1899, 1900, it was turned into an electric power plant. And as you can see there, it's part of the turbines that were used. Let's see if we can get a peek up here. This town is really old. It's one of the oldest towns in Stanislaus County. This facility hasn't changed much other than the fact that it's lost all the timbers on the top, the roof, and the roof trusses. But yeah, the Army Corps of Engineers has put some cement caps on top to prevent the top from eroding down and busting those walls down. So this is kind of interesting because the first flour mill washed out in the 1862 flood, and they used these two stones. In rebuilding the mill, David Tulloch ordered 5 sets of stone from Belgium, and they were shipped around the Horn to San Francisco. They measured 4 feet, and they were made of several pieces of granite cemented and bound together with iron hoops. These are the original stones that were used to mill flour. Somewhere online they said this jail dated back to 1850, but that isn't the case. All that iron back there is absolutely original. These iron cells were part of the Modesto jail, brought here in 1912 to detain drunks mostly. So this is what it looks like in here. It's got a cot down here. Look at that iron up there. No escaping from here. Let's go around here and see if we can see if there's actually 4 jail cells, 2 in the back. Indeed there are. Because they were used in Modesto, it's possible that outlaw Bill Dalton stayed in one of these when he was arrested in 1891 for a train robbery in Ceres, California. So right back there is the oldest operating general store in the state of California. It was built in 1852. It's been operating ever since. In the flood of 1955, the river crested all the way into that store. In fact, half the town was flooded at the time. It's still in operation. It's one of the coolest little general stores, I think, around. Here's a little clamper's plaque that indicates that it is indeed the oldest store of its kind in the state of California. It's a great place to buy an ice cream or a soda in the summertime here. This is the Miller's Saloon, and was once a hotel as well. Now it's an ice cream parlor, and upstairs a museum. It even housed a barber shop on the first floor. Now we're going to go find the house that Ulysses S. Grant actually stayed in when he was here visiting his brother-in-law. And it's right here on the corner up here. I went in this house in the 1970s when it was for sale because my parents were actually considering buying it. It's at the corner of Dean and Ellen Streets. Louis Dent built this house in 1851, I believe. So it was about a year old when Ulysses S. Grant walked through the front doors of that house. And he actually spent the night here for several weeks at a time, I understand. It's said this is the oldest house in Knights Ferry. It's got a tin roof. It's also said that maybe one of the children in the back of the house carved the name L. Dent on the window. It's now a private residence, so I can't go in it. But this house has been referred to as the Long House as well as the Kennedy House. But Louis Dent actually lived here. He built this house in 1851, and he left here in 1858 to go practice law in Stockton, California. His brother John Caramel Dent left Knights Ferry in 1862 to join General Grant's staff. Can you just imagine Ulysses S. Grant smoking a cigar out here behind the house or off here in the yard? So cool. This house has intrigued me for years, just knowing the fact that Ulysses S. Grant stayed here at a time in which nobody really knew who he was. In the 1860s, he became very famous and was pivotal in the Union defeating the South during the Civil War. 17625. It's a beautiful house, really. This here is the historic Abraham Shell House. It's built of limestone that was milled out of the ground not far from here. It was built in 1856, and that's the original facade. Very historic building. Abraham Shell was a major landowner in this area. And right next door is the Masonic Lodge, built in 1870, the Oak Summit Lodge. This is a stone foundation, built very solidly, has lasted many, many years. You think how old that is. Now, for many years, I thought that the founder of this town, William Knight, was buried on one of these corners, but that couldn't have been possible considering the fact that he was killed on November 9th, 1849, and this structure here was built in 1870. Over here, across the street, this vacant lot, this is where the Stanislaus County Courthouse was located, right across the street from the Knights Ferry Resort, which is a pretty nice restaurant. So this would have been a Civil War era location of the courthouse. There are very few pictures of it that I'm aware of, but you can actually see a picture of it in the panoramic shot that was shot from the ridge way back in the day. The courthouse would have been right here from 1865 to about 1875. It was also reported that Knight's body was buried at the base of a tree near the ferry crossing, which I believe is close to the Knights Ferry Resort. Here is the Knights Ferry Hook and Ladder Company. I believe this was reconstruction, but 1871. Talks about being the Hook and Ladder Fire Company. The wagon was purchased in New York, was shipped around the Horn, arriving in San Francisco in 1872. On arrival, it was claimed by a San Francisco fire company. A delegation from Knights Ferry liberated the fire wagon and brought it home. In 1998, the Oakdale Rural Volunteers completely rebuilt it to its original splendor. And it's very difficult to see through this very dirty glass. The Dents kind of completely took over this town. In fact, they named this town Dentville, and they helped lay out the town, all the streets. It didn't stick, though. A lot of people wanted to continue referring to it as Knights Ferry, and that's what it's known as today. Lewis Dent at one time was the Justice of the Peace as well as the Postmaster. And here's the community clubhouse. Over here is a little plaque. It was dedicated in 1930, so even this plaque is historic. It talks about William Knight came out here in 1844 as part of the Workman Rowland expedition to California, originally settling in Southern California. Mr. Knight came up here to an area near Woodland, California, where he established Knight's Landing. Later he came here to Knight's Ferry, where he started the business of having a ferry. History has recorded his death as being attributed to a gun battle, but there's been other historical accounts that suggest maybe he died in some other fashion. You know, early California history, it's kind of difficult to ascertain the truth from fiction, but nobody actually knows where William Knight's buried. His bones are buried, however, in this town. This is the Oddfellows Hall, but when it was built in 1871 by George McCabe, it was his store. When he went out of business in 1897, he sold it to the Oddfellows and he moved out of town. This here is the Community Methodist Church. It was built in 1900, so it's now 120 years old. It was built actually on the same foundation of the original Methodist Church, which was built in 1860. If you're ever in Central California, be sure to check out one of the oldest and most unique communities in the county. Your imagination just may take you back so far in history that you get a whiff of Grant cigar smoke wafting through town.